prayer, because really a prayer is words, right? And here and they're Tibetan words, and it's sung to a tune, but they actually words are expressions of thoughts, and that's the mind. And the mind is Buddha's expertise. I think there's no doubt about that. We might know that in our culture. I say around the world that we all love to talk about the Greeks. Well, here I am in Greece. You know, all the fancy words in English are all Greek, right? So we all go, because we're these, you know, Jews and Christians, we go back to the Greeks. We know very little about the Indians, but I'll talk about this. But meanwhile, Buddha came out of this. Anyway, we'll sing a little prayer that's expressing two thoughts. The first two lines are for anybody in the room who already identifies with being a Buddhist. It's reminding us of our reliance on his teachings and everything. And the second two lines are really could be for all of us, expressing, we'd say, sort of stating our purpose, or the Tibetans would say setting our motivation. So it just really means why we're here. So we're thinking together, we're here to listen, at least listen, and I'm going to be listening, believe me. I'm processing. Listening to Buddha's views, Buddha's way of seeing the world, essentially. His thoughts about how the world exists from his own experience. And so the implications of this. So for the Buddha, the implications of the mind are two things. We've got this marvelous potential to develop our mind. I mean, we'll discuss that. You know, from Buddha's view, it's extraordinary. And then on the basis of that developing our own potential, we then are, because we live in this world together, we're able to help others. So to listen for tools to do those things, that's the idea. It's the practical one. For tools to help us develop our own potential to help others. Thinking like that. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke Chognam la Jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki Drola penchir sangye dropa shog. So the key, you know, as I'm saying, the key to how to listen, and is the assumption about where the words are coming from, what you do with those words, you know. Like I said, you know, I would say, I'm not joking when I say that I think the mind is Buddha's expertise. But like I also say, that's not very known to us. You know, we don't know much about India. It was interesting, a couple of years ago I heard the Dalai Lama say something just very casual. He said it was these Indians, more than 3,000 years ago, who were the ones who began this incredible, amazing investigation into the nature of self. You know, so that kind of struck me. You know, I know because I'm a Buddhist that Buddha came out of this Indian tradition 2,500 years ago. But as I said, in our culture, we know, and our Jewish Christian culture, we don't know very much about India. So it really made me think, because this extraordinary tradition. I mean, I remember even recently hearing on BBC Radio, BBC World Service, that the anthropologists can find no evidence of any tools of aggression, for example, which says something huge about a group of people. So if we look back into these Indians, their job was the mind. What they did, they cultivated this technique that the world knows now as mindfulness meditation. And we have many interesting ideas about what it is, and there are many interesting ideas. But what it comes from is this extraordinary, skillful, psychological technique that enables a person to utterly subdue, in a most disciplined, clear way, the grosser, kind of more berserk levels of our mind. You know, all thoughts, all the feelings, all the emotions that we sort of think is just this kind of natural chaos, but have been able to go beyond all that level of cognition to a subtler level of cognition, a subtler level of our own mind. If we study this, if we train this technique, I mean, any of us now, if we wanted to do this to accomplish the goal of this technique, it would take us several years up in the mountains. You know, give up sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You can't do it in daily life. To really achieve the result, which is, in other words, accessing a level of mind, a level of one's own cognition that we do not posit as existing in our materialist culture. And this is a really massive point, because as soon as we hear the word meditation, we kind of lose the plot and get all mystical. You see someone closing their eyes and looking kind of interesting, we have no idea what they're doing, because that's not how we think of psychology. And certainly when you hear about a technique that enables you to go beyond the conceptual and the sensory, that and the materialist model, because we posit the brain, immediately just says it must be something like a spirit or a soul, and then there's sort of cynicism about it. But Buddha doesn't use the word soul, he doesn't use the word spirit. He talks about the mind, or the word consciousness. These words are used synonymously. But his view of what the mind is, and necessarily its potential, you could say are so radically different that it's actually quite surprising to us, you know. So let's just, first, before we look into what Buddha says and what our potential is, because that potential exists in the mind, we better be clear, even intellectually, what he means by the mind. Because like I'm saying, it's radically different from how we think. And this is a part of the thing here is, you know, we say the word mind. Every one of us in this room wouldn't question our definition of it. We just assume, we have our own definition. And so then if we hear Buddha's view about what the mind can do, it sounds pretty cosmic. Therefore, it sounds like sounds like a belief system, because we don't seem to think we can prove it. So first of all, even before we talk about what the Buddha says the mind is, this person Buddha kind of get a sense of where he comes from, you know. I say that around the world, I go to different places, and we all humans have we seem to have the same questions. It's kind of interesting. But there's only one question I've ever had from one person. It was in Nelson in New Zealand. He was a scientist, and he said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? It was a really interesting question, because that's our assumption about spiritual teachings, I think. It's kind of revelation. I mean, I was brought up a Catholic, and there's no question, it's revelation. Because why? From whom? From a being called God, who necessarily who is above everybody else, who is the source of the universe, who is the source of me, who created the rules, so therefore who is to be obeyed, you know. And I'm not criticizing this view, but that's our typical view of religious teachings. So therefore necessarily something you can't prove, necessarily mystical, necessarily beyond ordinary people. Well, first point, that's not the Buddha's view. Buddha does not assert a creator. He has his own views about how the world came into being, how universes exist, and who we are and where we come from. And we're going to be discussing this, because this is the basis, this is the nuts and bolts of the Buddha's view about the universe. And the key point about the Buddha's view of the universe isn't just to get an interesting bunch of philosophical views in your head and then pass your philosophy exam. The point of all of this is to hear the experiential implications of it, you know. Which means we really then to really understand what you, as a Buddhist, what is Buddhist practice, you know. So then if Buddha's not a creator, if he doesn't assert a creator, therefore the Buddhist teachings aren't revelation. So you have to ask, well, where did the information come from? It seems sort of an evident question. You probably don't ask it, you know. Well, if you read a cookbook, or any book of instructions, I think we know without question that the information is coming from the experience of the person who wrote it. Well, let's hope it does. Or at least even if it's intellectual, they're stating their system, you know. So it seems to me a cookbook is either directly coming from the person who wrote it, which means they've experienced these cakes and know how to make them, and so are telling you their experience. They may be being respectful, are telling you his mummy's experience. That's fine, it's perfectly reasonable. Or he's made it up, which is pretty shocking. I mean, you know, even with a cookbook, the rigour and discipline to make sure you have right information is really intense, just for a cookbook. But somehow when it comes to spiritual teachings, we think, oh, I'm allowed to think what I like, because we assume there's no rigour there. We assume that, you know, it's just whatever you feel, it's sort of mystical, no one can prove anything. I mean, you know, people go off and do a course, a spiritual course, get all excited and write a book about it. No one asks for their credentials. No one says, where does this information come from? Because we think, I'm allowed to think what I like. We assume that about spiritual teachings, which I think is a bit arrogant, a bit insane, meaning you're allowed to think. We think, I'm allowed to think what I like. Well, we are, yes, you're absolutely right. But the whole deal is, and this is a Buddha's point, whatever goes on in your mind is the basis of how you think and feel, is the basis of what you do in your life, is the actual basis of your happiness and your suffering. So for the Buddha, the mind is the point. Whatever goes on in our mind is the basis of happiness and suffering. Well, you know, if you play the piano or make a cake, whatever goes on in your mind has to inform the cake and the music coming out. It's sort of obvious, but when it comes to spiritual, we don't think this way. It's kind of fascinating. So then these teachings, where do they come from? Well, unless he's cheated and stolen someone else's ideas or made them up, and that's for us to find out, they've come from Buddha's experience, his own direct experience. We have to assume that. Don't believe it, you have to check it to make sure that cook is valid, to make sure the Buddha is valid. Just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. So it's that approach to the Buddha's teachings. There's the word belief, and belief is reasonable. It means having confidence in somebody. And you have your confidence in that cook if you've tasted their cakes and you've seen other people make their cakes, so they seem a reasonable person whom you can now pay your money to tell you how to cook. We would check, we would be rigorous in our checking even of a cook. And you can have confidence in that person, like belief. You're not really that good yet, you haven't made many cakes, so that's reasonable. Well, it's the same in your approach to the Buddha's teachings. But the approach is that this is information coming from Buddha's own direct experience. In what way? In his own mind. In his own mind. So essentially, actually the word Buddha, Sanskrit, and the Tibetan word for it, Sangye, the kind of the etymology is really tasty. The first syllable, sang, implies the utter eradication from one's own mind of all the neuroses, all the ego, all the fears, all the nonsense, all the depression, anxiety, jealousy, low self-esteem, arrogance, all the unhappy parts of us that we utterly know. As soon as we say those words, everybody recognizes that. So this is the first shocking point. Buddha has found, from his own experience, having done the job himself, that one can get rid of this stuff. It is not at the core of our being. This is almost the fundamental essence of all Buddha's teachings, and therefore all Buddha's practice. That's already shocking. Not to mention the second one, gye, that implies the development to perfection, literally, of all the other stuff in there. Kindness, wisdom, love, compassion, generosity, the stuff that we know is the good stuff. So speaking really simply, that is expressing the essence of all of Buddha's practices, all of Buddha's teachings, all his philosophy, all his psychology, all his metaphysics. Everything leads to the accomplishment in one's own mind of that, the fulfillment of that potential. That's the essence of it. So I mean, the implications of this are kind of insane. But even hearing it simply, it's kind of shocking. Why? Because we take as a given that attachment and fears and arrogance and jealousy, and although we can't stand it all, we just assume and nobody questions. Our models of the mind assume, our science assumes that they are natural. And what we mean by natural is that they're so natural that you'd be unnatural if you didn't have them. So we utterly assume that. I think there's no model of the mind in the Western world, the modern world, that would question that. So in other words, we give equal status to all the neuroses and all the goodness. So of course we hopefully can find some way to live our life where they're fairly balanced and the good is maybe better, more than the bad. Because we can see we see the evidence of the presence of these in people's minds. Look at the evidence of too much psychosis and anger and rage and jealousy and depression. It's nightmarish. So we know they're horrible stuff. But we just assume they're normal. So our techniques in psychology don't ever go towards actually eradicating them from the mind. This seems completely too cosmic for words. But that is what Buddha's saying. So simple. The word Buddha implies the both. There's this nice analogy that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So broadly speaking, and I'll be quoting this a lot, and it's the name of our teachings too. It's the entire Buddhist path is contained in this. You know, the work, the initial work we have to do on our own mind. That's the basis that is for our own benefit. Initially, is the wisdom wing, lessening the neuroses and growing, therefore, naturally more contentment, more courage, more clarity in our own self. And on the basis of this, we can then cultivate the compassion wing, which is our ability to be of benefit to this planet, you know, or whoever. So, even just the word nirvana, that refers to the wisdom wing. The word nirvana is not some alternative to heaven. It's a word, it actually just means cessation of suffering and its causes. That's what you accomplish on the wisdom wing. So these are psychological states. You know, I say it, it's true, it's a joke, but it's true. Buddha didn't say the word psychology. I don't think he'd been to Greece. It's only since all our psychologists and philosophers, you know, we really do appreciate the Greeks, so half our fancy words are in Greek. But Buddha didn't say psychology. He said mind, you know, whatever the word is in Hindi, I have no idea. But it's not wrong to say Buddha's a psychologist. That's not even a cliche, it's an utter simple truth. But that's not evident to us because we think it's spiritual and we don't use the word mind when we think spiritual. So you really got to redefine your terms if you want to hear me properly, okay? Don't use our definition of psychology. Don't use your definition of mind. To hear these words, you're going to have to. I'm not asking you to believe what I'm saying. Because that's one of the points about the Buddha. If what he's saying is not from revelation, he's not speculating, he hasn't made it up, let's hope, then he's not, and equally he's not asking us to believe him. Can you imagine if I were Einstein here, telling you about relativity? You know perfectly well it's come from my experience. I've observed it. You know that. We understand that concept. Therefore, you know it's not revelation. You'd be very surprised if I told you I had a vision about relativity last night. You'd chuck me out of the door immediately, as a maniac. I didn't have a dream about it. You're hoping I'm not stealing it. The worst sin in science is to steal someone else's ideas. Look at the rigour. But look what we do in spiritual. Everybody grabs everybody's ideas and says they're their own, and no one cares anyway. I mean, it's so shocking, actually. And I'm for sure, you know, if I asked you to believe that relativity is true, you'd better believe it. You'd again be shocked. And this is the point. This is so surprising to us, because we think about morality and spirituality like that. This is not the Buddha's view. He's like Einstein, insofar as what he's presenting has come from his own experience. Therefore, he's not asking you to believe him. So what is he doing? Well, like Einstein, I'm telling you what I found to be so from my own observation, and then I will present you my findings, I will present you my methodology, and I'll say, over to you, baby. I'm happy, I found it. It's up to you now. That's the approach here. That's the approach. So, but the idea in spiritual is so deeply ingrained because we have creator models. I'm not criticizing. Please, if you have faith in a creator, I'm not trying to dissuade you. Buddha would just say, you know, it's appropriate to talk about these things, but he doesn't have that view. He, in fact, would, you know, argue with it. He says we don't need creating. We're going to go into this. So there's different ways of talking about Buddhism, you know. Some people, the entire 3 days will be just sitting here learning to do some kind of meditation. I won't be doing that. For me, I always, since a kid, always wanted the big picture, somehow the big view. Always, you know, I'm not trying to sound noble or anything, but wanted to know what and why and how. And sort of, you know, when I was a kid, I was a Catholic, very devoted to God. But then kind of gave that up when I was 19. I preferred boys, so you can't have both, can you, when you're a good Catholic? So it was goodbye God, hello boys. Then I came to London in the 60s. I was kind of ripe and ready for revolution, and then quickly I became kind of a radical lefty communist, and then kind of black politics, then feminist politics, and then I bumped into these Tibetans, and so far so good. Well, it was interesting because anyway, that, you know, this is, for whatever reason, the Buddhist view and the way it's taught in Tibet, because there are many different ways of presenting Buddhism, like I'm saying. Very much an emphasis on the big picture, because Buddhism, in fact, which might be surprising to us, is in fact a worldview. A worldview. The thing that's obvious to the world is this thing called meditation, with your eyes closed, something mysterious happening. And this is one element, a crucial element of Buddhist teachings. But the bigger picture is what is the universe, who are we, where we come from. It's an entire worldview coming from the minds of these great thinkers, philosophers, meditators, and coming out of the Buddhist tradition, the group before the Buddha. So basically these Hindus, these Indians, they created this technique, like I said, which is one of the central techniques in Buddhism. When Buddha diverged in his own direction, specifically in relation to his own findings about the self and the way the universe exists. Then, of course, this central technique was one of the key ones still of the Buddhists, and people today still, utilizing this technique. So the Buddha then diverged into his own direction, in particular in relation to his own findings about the self. So that's the essence of really what you're trying to do as a Buddhist, to unpack and unravel using this technique. In the long term, we need to cultivate this particular technique. It's known as single-pointed concentration. And that's this single-pointed concentration is referring to a subtler, like I said before, a subtler level of mind. And in the long term, to accomplish what the Buddha says we can, in the long term, we need to actually cultivate this subtle state of consciousness. Most of us in this life won't accomplish that level of it. We can certainly practice it. We'll talk about it. Technically, it's not complicated. But it's one of the central techniques that's used, in itself it's got benefits, but it's just a technique that's used to get the mind to be more honed and more sharp and more clear so that we can do the real job of unpacking and unraveling the contents of our mind. Because another way of putting the whole Buddhist path is in terms of getting rid of suffering and developing happiness. Speaking really simply. Another way of presenting it, it's a system of ethics and morality. They all come to the same thing. They all come to the same thing. It mightn't be evident hearing it, but eventually, as if one is practicing and studying it, all these things lead to this cultivation of this potential of this human mind of ours, you know. The Buddha would say everybody possesses. We all possess the potential to be Buddha. That's how he says it. So what happened in this when these amazing Indians created this technique in their pursuit of what is the self? Then they went internally. So we look, in our world, we think about the self. We think of psychology. We think of Jung. We think of Freud. We think of the brain. Listen, I'm not criticizing, but they did not look at the brain. You ask them where their brain was, they'd probably never heard the word, but they know their mind. Because for them, the Buddha, and this is a fundamental point, we'll go through this, for the Buddha, the mind is not your brain. It doesn't mean it doesn't play a role. He's not being fundamentalist, you know. It's quite nuanced, but to hear it, we really get the point, and to really hear what Buddha's saying, the stuff we're going to talk about, we need to take this as our hypothesis, that your mind is not your brain, first point. So for them, the mind's internal. So what they did is, in this subtle state of concentration, these Indians, and of course this is the basis still now of Buddhist psychology, the model of the mind as presented in Buddhism, they mapped the mind, but they mapped it internally. This is a big surprise to us. We don't have techniques like this at all. We need a microscope and a physical thing to look at. For the Buddha, these previous Indians, it's internal. And I think in our culture we don't trust the internal. We don't trust what we call emotions and feelings. We think they're not kind of rigorous. Not the way the Buddha thinks. So if you study the Buddhist mind, the Buddhist model of the mind in depth, it's astonishing the depth and clarity in the literature over the centuries. It goes to incredible depth, and it's utterly necessary for a person who's a serious Buddhist to really comprehend the theoretical presentation of what consciousness is and how it functions. Why? Because that's the central job of being a Buddhist. Ridding the mind of all the rubbish and developing all the goodness, which is internal. It's internal. So these words, like mind, compassion, hate, we know these words, but we have we have definitions of them, and crucially understandings of the causes of them that are so different, it's quite hard to hear what Buddha's saying. So like I said, for the Buddha, it's not a joke to say that the mind is his expertise. And he's saying that what goes on in our mind is the source, the main source. Well, he'd actually say the main source of the universe. That sounds like a joke, but I'm not going to talk about it. But crucially, the main source of our happiness and suffering. Now this is itself quite shocking already. Because if Paros is unkind to me and I'm crying, what's wrong, Robina? And I'll give a detailed description of Panos's action. You won't be surprised. You won't say, well, that's no reason to think he's no reason to be unmiserable just because he punched you. We'd be shocked to say that. We assume. Our assumption's so deep, and this is the assumption of dogs and rats and monkeys as well. It's deep in the bones, Buddha says, of sentient beings' minds. And he says it's a mistake. Panos's action of unkindness is not the main cause of my suffering. But as far as our world is concerned, our models of the mind, science, and don't hear this in any punitive kind of way, it's really quite a subtle point. And we can prove we understand it by our actions every day, but we don't really think it through. Because it's so spontaneous for us to think that out there is the source of my happiness, and out there is the source of my suffering. And don't hear it as religious and punitive. Oh, you shouldn't like chocolate cake. You've got to learn to be happy on your own. Don't hear it like that. It's a technical point that Buddha's making. But because we can't hear it properly, that indicates, it's quite subtle, it indicates how opposite we are, Because the default mode of all of us is just the natural assumption we have is, people's words, the taste of the cake, the weather, the feelings in the body, the actions of the Catholic nuns when I was at school, the actions of my mummy and daddy when I was a kid, that they are the source. And it's proved, because when we go, one of you's a therapist, you kind of work out why I get angry and why I keep choosing crummy boyfriends like Panos. You've got to look back into the past, like a needle in a haystack, aren't we? We all look in the past. It's natural in us, utterly spontaneous. We look back in the past for this, to see what happened, why I'm angry, why I'm jealous, why I get into the habit of crummy relationships. The Buddha would say there's something wrong with that, but he says we're not looking at the main thing. But we've got to look at the mind. We're going to go to this. So let's just quickly look at the Buddha's view about what the mind is and what the mind is not, just to sort of get ourselves clear when we use this word, at least we can take Buddha's deal about it, because I'm going to be discussing his views, right? Well, first, it's not your brain. It's not physical. So straight away we say that, we seem to think, oh, well, that's called a spirit or a soul. No, he doesn't use those words. He uses the same word, mind. But there are subtler levels of it, that's all. Second point, your mind, well, it's already indicated, goes to these subtler levels, which we need eventually to unpack and unravel, utilising this technique in order to do the job of ridding it of all the rubbish and growing all the goodness. Meditation itself is not the point. It's just a technique that you use to hone your mind to do the real job. The real job, as Lama Yeshe puts it, of being your own therapist. To become intimately familiar with the contents of your own mind. The next thing about the mind, this is quite shocking, contrary to the materialist view and contrary to all the creative views, we are not the handiwork of another person. This is almost quite shocking for us. Your mother and father did not make you. They gave you a body, nobody can argue. That's evident to eyes. That's clear. Your body comes from mummy and daddy. But not your anger, and not your kindness, and not your psychosis, and not your love, and not your compassion, and not your being good at football or good at music. These are mental tendencies that are our own, Buddha says. This is the most fundamental point in Buddhism. That when we can begin to even theoretically take this on board, the implication of this for practice is where we get it, the penny drops, you know. Our mind is our own. So it's obvious if we didn't therefore begin in our mother's womb, or whenever the Catholics say, I remember now I was talking about abortion, some people say, the Catholics say that you start at 40 weeks or something, that God puts the soul in there at about 40 weeks. There's different views, isn't there? But from the Buddhist point of view, it's very clear. The egg and sperm of your mummy and daddy go into the womb. Well, these days it's more complicated. They go into petri dishes and things, don't they? It's all based on the old-fashioned way of getting born, okay? The teachings, so that's very interesting. Got to come up with new ideas when it comes to eggs and sperm. Comes to petri dishes. So, as far as Buddha is concerned, conception, which is when the egg and sperm come together, what causes it to become the body of you is the entry of your consciousness. From where? Well, clearly from before. So this is where the business of reincarnation. It's not just some hippie idea. People think hippies made it up. I'm joking, you know. It's just, these Indians way back, you know. So it's several thousand years old, this view of reincarnation, coming from a very sophisticated presentation. The Buddha is clearly the same. That our consciousness doesn't begin in the mother's womb. It's got its own continuity. It goes back and back and back. And indeed, when we die, it'll go forward, forward, forward. So we're going to go into this. This implies all this business about karma, which again is not some hippie idea, it's not some random stuff. It's very broadly and deeply taught, you know, in the literature, the explanations. This is, as far as Buddha is concerned, it's a way of presenting how the world is, why they're suffering, why happiness, why this, why that. Karma. So your consciousness is not the product of your mummy and daddy. It's not the result of, you're not the handiwork of a creator. There's no creator as far as Buddha is concerned. He has the word superior being. If you hear the actual qualities of a being who has accomplished Buddhahood, it could sound like the qualities of God. There's many similarities, you can see this. But the crucial difference in Buddhism, fundamental, is that there's a superior being. Buddha uses that term, Arya being in Sanskrit, is not the source of anybody else. We are the source of ourself. This is a sort of a shocking point. Because experientially we don't think so. We think, oh, I didn't ask to get born. We feel like a victim of somebody else. This is very deep, the way we think about ego. We'll go into this. As far as Buddha is concerned, we are the fruit of our own past. Quite literally. Literally the fruit of our own past. So this consciousness goes to far more subtle levels. It did not begin in your mother's womb. It goes back and back. It will not end at death. It will continue. And it's the main source. And it goes to these subtle levels. So there's many different approaches to what the mind is. And to understand Buddhism, if you read Buddhist teachings, to understand where he's coming from, and not just treat it as some kind of mystical thing that can't be proved, you have to know theoretically the meaning of the words. And all knowledge starts with theory, doesn't it? I mean, you can't suddenly sit at the kitchen table with a bunch of eggs and flour and sugar and milk and hope sort of a revelation will come about how to make a cake. People would laugh at you, you know. You have to learn the words first, learn the theories first. It's hardly surprising to us. But we like to be mystical about things. Okay, so the reason The reason to look into our mind, the reason for how to develop our own incredible potential. So it's got such a reasonable meaning, you know. It's not a question of believing it, like as if belief would help. Somehow we laugh if you say you believed in mathematics. People think you're ridiculous. You can prove mathematics. We don't think of it as belief. Well, as soon as we say belief, it assumes not provable. It assumes beyond normal. It assumes you can't handle it. Somehow you've got to stuff it in, you know. But we know there's no science. Human beings can't. I mean, human beings created it. So we say you believe in. But the crucial point here is to see the difference between believing in something and applying it. If you can believe in maths, it works. But it won't get you far. Even if mummy says, go and buy me 3 oranges, you can't do it because you don't know how to use it. Believing in it is good because it does work. So believing, oh, I believe in karma, what good is that? It's a meaningless concept. It's an utterly meaningless concept. It's presented in the teachings, detailed descriptions of how it works. As far as Buddha is concerned, for example, it's a natural law. No one made it up. He's not a creator. No one created it. He's observed it. And this part takes time to hear. He's observed it. He presents what he's seen. So believing in it is fair enough, but it's not helpful. Believing in botany, what good is that? I believe it works. That's great, but you can't use it if you don't know how to don't know how it works. That's the crucial point here. So the Buddhist one is it's got to be hands-on. It's got to be hands-on. It's got to be working with it, and then using that as your basis for interpreting things, just like you do with maths or botany. It's pretty reasonable. So you can say that Buddhism is definitely a method for how to get happy and stop suffering. Absolutely that. It's almost like a basis. You could also say it's a method of morality, which comes to the same thing. And it's a system of wisdom. It's a system of, it's a philosophical view about how things are. They all come to the same thing. So the key thing, though, like I'm saying, is the mind. So let's just take it from that perspective. Buddha's saying, whatever goes on in our mind, and we know from the second we wake up until the second we go to sleep, the mind doesn't stop. But for most of us, because it's like underneath, isn't it? If there's a football field a mile away from here, and it's full of 50,000 people, we'd hear this roar, wouldn't we? And we know intellectually it's 50,000 individual voices all saying particular words. But you can just hear the roar. It's like our mind. This quiet roar underneath. But there are literally, even the Western psychology says there are thousands of thoughts a second. And they're just constantly there, aren't they? We call this our unconscious. And naturally we assume the unconscious is something mystical. Well, for the Buddha, the job is to unpack and unravel that, to get absolute, utter clarity about the contents of our own mind. And this is why this technique that these Indians invented more than 3,000 years ago is so utterly outrageous. We analyze what it is. The degree of clarity that we can accomplish, according to Buddhism, coming back to this technique, is beyond conception in our culture. It sounds like mystical. So, this mind of ours, we know from the second we wake up, we're immediately on autopilot. We don't have to remember how to get out of bed again and learn it. We don't have to remember to go to the toilet and what to do and pull your dress up and sit and put the toilet seat up. We know all these things. We've programmed ourselves, have we not? We do. So mainly, we can look at it. We're mainly on autopilot. We've programmed ourselves in a million things. Look at us in a day. We're just so on autopilot. So therefore, of course, we're paying attention to the outside world. It's a busy, complicated thing, this outside world. We have to pay attention. That's our expertise. We're geniuses at doing physical things. We're geniuses at driving and walking and making breakfast and going to the toilet, these things. But we therefore don't pay any attention to what's underneath. We don't give any credibility to it. We don't think it's important. We just think it's the way it is. Our trouble is then, it's only when it comes to the surface, it's only when one of those 50,000 voices is louder than all the rest that we'll then pay attention to it. But that's pretty intense already, and it's way too late to now pay attention. When I'm about to kill Panos, I'm full of rage, and then we go, what'll I do when I get angry? Well, it's a bit late. It's like Vesuvius has just exploded. You don't wait to say, what'll I do about it? It's too late. To say what'll I do about it when it's come to the surface, because we've not paid attention deeper down, is like driving along the freeway at 120 kilometres an hour and your wheels start to fall off. Oh, what'll I do? A bit late, okay? And this is a really powerful point. You know, we have incredible maintenance for our cars, for our houses, for everything. We even have incredible maintenance for our bodies. But not for our mind, not for our thoughts and feelings and emotions, really and truly. And I think the reason is because we think the external world is the source of our feelings and emotions. But we can know our mind is there the whole time. So the whole job of being a Buddhist then, if whatever goes on in our mind, deep, deep, deep down as well, is the source of happiness and suffering, now and in the future, then we had better pay attention to it. And that's what we need to work with and change. That's his simple approach. Intellectually, this is not complicated. It's just the hardest job we'll ever do because we're addicted to taking care of the external. We don't pay attention and don't have, you know, and of course there are 1,000 explanations of why anger, why love, why compassion. But Buddha's got his own particular approach, you know. And he says, finally, which is, again is so shocking to us, that the neuroses, the fears, the stuff that he would call ego, and we'll go into this clearly. He says this is the source of our suffering. The source, the main source of our own suffering, and indeed the source of why we harm others. And that the virtues, the goodness, the kindness, and it sounds kind of cute almost, is the source of our own happiness and joy, and the source of being able to be used to others. The concept is not complicated. The doing of this job, using Buddha's model, is pretty intense. So if what goes on in our mind is the main source, and long term, the Buddha would say, this is where the business of karma comes in, is the source of the future as well, then we better start knowing what the mind is and know the techniques to use to work with it. Because Buddha's outrageous point is that these neuroses, this ego stuff, this is not at the core of our being. This does not finally define who we are. This is kind of shocking because we utterly assume it does. We utterly assume, oh, I'm just depressed. It's just who I am. I'm angry, just who I am. I'm jealous. I'm this. I'm lazy. We assume this is just who we are. And it feels so prevalent sometimes. But the Buddha's view is also that the goodness in us, you know, I'm not trying to sound like Pollyanna, the virtue, the kindness, the forgiveness, the clarity, the intelligence, this is what defines us. This actually is at the core of our being. This is actually the substance of who we are, finally. And the job of being the Buddha's job is to accomplish this, the ridding of the rubbish and the growing of the goodness. I mean, it's quite a shocking concept. You know, I mean, just speaking normally, if you want to use a therapist and I go and ask you for methods to get rid of all ego, all fears, all anger, all jealousy, all permanently, you think I'm insane. Really seriously delusional. But this is what Buddha's saying. We don't hear it so bluntly, you know. We hear it in nice Indian, Tibetan religious terms. Oh, la-di-da, we can all achieve nirvana, wow, wow, you know. We don't hear it properly. That's our problem. Because it's religion, remember, isn't it? Okay, so our mind is not physical. It is not the handiwork of a creator or mummy or daddy. And that's a shock to us as well, but we'll go into all this, we'll explain. So the implication of just this is intense. Because if my anger's mine, Panos' punch is his. No argument, he punched me, you all saw it. Let's just say. Equally, why are you happy, Robina? Oh, Panos was so kind to me. Well, you also saw him be generous and look after me. You saw it, it's evident, it's true. But we assume that that's the source of my happiness. And we assume the punch is the main source of my suffering. This goes without saying for us. To even now hear that it isn't is a bit shocking to us. Makes us kind of, you know, my goodness. So we have to analyze this. And this is the essence, this is the basis, the foundation of then, it's the implication of practice. But it's the hardest thing we'll ever do because this idea that here's the source of my happiness and suffering is pretty deeply ingrained. And we're going to go into this. So, okay, if whatever goes on in our mind is you know, plays a role in our life, is the source of happiness and suffering, and if we want to be happy and don't want to suffer, that's the first question to ask. Well, do you want to stop suffering? And even though our definitions of it are different, we all know it refers to the horrible stuff. So, yes, please. Do you want to be happy? Yes, please. These words sound a bit simple, but let's take it from there. Well, then if it's true, according to the Buddha, that what goes on in our mind is the main source, we'd better hear what he has to say. We better hear his recipe. Pretty reasonable. So there's, okay, when you study the Buddhist mind, in the Buddhist texts, you study the mind in depth. There's two ways of presenting the mind. And one is what they call the epistemological model, which is the way mind functions. Now this itself, it's absolutely mind-blowing. The clarity and the subtlety and the way the mind works is unbelievable. And this is coming from the experience of those who have plumbed the depths of their own mind internally. Not from looking with the microscope on a brain. It's internal. This is utterly fascinating. I think scientists will be blissed out to study this model because it's so intricate, so precise, but they've got to posit the possibility they're not discussing the brain, and that's too hard for most scientists. Well, some. And the second way mind works, you learn about the contents of your mind. And we're going to discuss this one. But already there's something really interesting about this point. So in the epistemological model, you got sensory consciousness, and I'm going to labour this point, the way your mind functions, being not physical, through the medium of the eyeball, the ears, the tactile, the nerves, the body, in other words. The body is, the eyeball does not see things from the Buddhist perspective. It's your eye consciousness, that part of your mind that functions through the medium of a working eyeball, etc., etc. So this is already very interesting. If I were to say to you, let's say, what a pretty cup. I could say that, let's say. So what happened there was, I went over here, I picked it up, and then within a millisecond of my eye consciousness meeting this object, I then said, what a pretty cup. So we would all naturally deduce, wouldn't we, that my eyes are seeing a pretty cup. It seems reasonable to think this, but the Buddha says it's not true. Sensory consciousness, as far as they're concerned, is like dumb animals, with respect to animals. That they're incredibly limited in their capacity for cognition. So the moment eye consciousness looks here, all it can cognize is shape and colour. So therefore you've got to ask the question, where does what a pretty cup, where does that come from? And that's the point now. And this is you'll laugh maybe, but this is deadly true. Quicker than Google, what happened is this. Quicker than Google, my mental consciousness, and sort of the Tibetan's point here, my mental consciousness was accessed. Quicker than Google. There was no kind of, oh, what's this? And look up Google, round, blue, oh, that's cool. You understand? You don't do that because you're trained. We've got it memorized. But where that comes from is not the eye consciousness. This is so shocking if we hear about it. If I'm in love with Panos, does he not look the most handsome, divine person in the universe? And we assume it's your eyes seeing it. But when I'm angry with him, how does he look then? I assume my eyes are seeing this horrible, ugly person. We just take all this for granted. This point alone about how your mental consciousness is the one that makes up the story, basically, that what a pretty cup is a series of thoughts in the mental consciousness that I have decided, I have created, based upon my taste in this life, what I've developed, the things I like, I don't like. It's all thoughts. This is the point. We can spend the rest of the day, the week, the 3 days, just on this point, unpacking this one, which is essentially what you're doing as a Buddhist. This is already profound. Because look at how we experience the world. It's through our senses. Without senses, we'd be dead. We'd think we wouldn't exist. So the entire universe out there, is it not, is experienced through our senses. Things we smell, things we hear, taste, touch. But we assume they exist like that. This is really the point the Buddha's making. But what's going on is, because your mental consciousness is working, it's got these millions of stories, opinions, ideas, viewpoints, thoughts, concepts. But because we're so trained to work with our senses, we don't notice that what an ugly person, what a beautiful thing. We don't even analyze it. It's coming from your own mental consciousness, from your own series of thoughts that you've practiced. We know everybody has different opinions, but we don't follow it through. If someone looks at Paros, they might think, they hate Greeks. They'll be total racist, evil, evil monster. Another person thinks he's gorgeous, which should blow our minds already. This proves the point the Buddha's making, that everything's made up by our mind, our mental consciousness, that the source of everything is in here. It's our opinions. You know, if you've got a really fundamentalist racist, you know it's not their eyes. You know it's not their eyes. You know it's their stupid thoughts. We know it when it's extreme. But when it's just normal, we don't question. But this is the essence of what Buddha's saying. That therefore we have to delve into the thoughts. These millions of viewpoints in here, all piled away. And the Buddha would say, you know, you came fully programmed with these from the second of conception. You're not like a blank slate at the time of birth. You've come with your program with your own stuff, good and bad. So this is literally the way Buddha says. So it's not no question the mind is the main thing for him. That we're programmed with these trillions of viewpoints. Thoughts are viewpoints. But our trouble is because we're so addicted to our own set of viewpoints. If you're a really fundamentalist, you know, you don't say, oh, I think that person's quite ugly, but I'm sure it's just my eye consciousness getting a bit mistaken here. No, you don't say that. They are ugly, and ugliness is coursing in their veins along with their blood. And how dare they do that to poor innocent me? We think, in fact, as Lama Zopa puts it, this is so shocking. We think, Lama Zopa said, and it's so shocking to hear this, that the vast majority of humans on this planet have no idea that what goes on in their minds plays any role at all. This is how deeply ingrained we are, Buddha says, with our delusional thoughts. Luckily we have virtuous thoughts as well, aren't we fortunate? But mostly we just come programmed with all our opinions set in stone. And then we continue to reinforce them. But we don't even think, and that's what's so shocking. I don't think that anger, I know I'm angry. But I don't think it's my anger. I think it's not fair because he did that and he caused me to be angry. So we know we have anger. We know we have depression. We know we have joy. But we're so convinced it's like the result of something that happened out there. I'm this innocent victim of it. But it's a series of thoughts, Buddha says. A series of opinions, of viewpoints. So it's a pretty intense concept. Literally all the way down to even that's a cup. Forget about pretty cup or ugly cup. So Buddha's deal is this, dealing with the conceptual stories in our mind. Unpacking and unraveling them to degrees of subtlety with respect to us and our culture we do not do. Because we're more concerned about the external. This is Buddha's expertise, not kidding. So the reason you sit down and meditate, the reason you do mindfulness is not just to get some nice gooey feeling, not to make all the pain go away, not just to relax, which is some of the conceptions we have. It's simply the technique to help us start to hear and listen to and unpack and unravel this chaos so we can sort it out. So the one obstacle to our doing that job is that we think, we just got born this way. We think it's normal. Whatever's there is just normal. Second, we think it's the source, it's coming from someone else. We really believe I'm this innocent victim and suddenly anger comes because he did that. The anger is not coming from me, we don't think. It's a state of mind. We know we're angry, there's no question. But he is the fault. That's so powerful. And he might have punched me. That's not even the argument here. But all Buddha's saying is he did punch you, Robina. That's his problem. What's yours, baby? Yours is called anger. Yours is called depression. Yours is called jealousy. Yours, and so that's scary because that sounds like blame, Sounds like blame. Not blame. For the Buddha, it's accountability. Because he says, honey, what goes on in here that's yours. They're a bunch of habits you brought with you, sweetheart. And if you sort these out, then that's the key to success. So it's technically not impossible to comprehend, just hard to hear it and to practice it because we're addicted to other methods. We're addicted to other views, We believe it's Paros' fault. It feels like it. Even I blame him for making me happy as well. Why are you happy, Robina? Oh, well, it's Paros' fault. He was kind to me. What choice do I have? I've got to be happy. We feel like that. So we really don't have to be told that that Paros is the blame. We just assume he is. This is how deep it goes. So it's, like I said, it's more nuanced than merely saying Paros doesn't play a role. He does, but he doesn't play the main role. All Buddha's saying is the main one is the mind, your interpretation of it, your habits. This is the job. being a Buddhist, based on what he says we can accomplish, this then is the job to be done, to unpack, to get to become familiar with, and then to unpack and unravel the contents of the mind. So, okay, according to whose view? Well, clearly Buddha's got his own view about the mind. You know, you're going to buy into Buddha's view of what the mind is, what its contents are. It's not something absolute. And you're going to pay attention to that garden, you've got to learn botany. You've got to play the piano, you don't just put your fingers on it and hope some nice sound comes out. Well, you could do that. But there are systems, you know. You've got to play the piano according to Bach's laws. Well, here we're deciding, if you're a Buddhist, you've got to buy into Buddha's explanation, to take that as your hypothesis to help you use his method of what the mind is to interpret your mind. Every time you go study psychology, you're studying someone's methodology, aren't you? You're just plucking it out of the sky. You're not necessarily believing Buddha's right, but you're using it as your start to investigate it, to find out for yourself that it's valid. Because finally, we are the boss, you know. So, okay, let's look then at our mental consciousness, which is where, as Lama Zopa puts it, that's where the workshop is. In the mental consciousness, in all the thoughts and feelings and emotions and unconscious and subconscious and instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of our inner being, that's our mental consciousness, or our mind, you know, but apart from the senses. As Lama Yeshe says, we get hugely misled by the senses. We make the body the boss, you know. And this is something really important to comprehend, which we'll go into. So before I start going into the mental consciousness and its contents, anybody got any questions? Any thoughts, any clarity about terms or whatever you like? We're going to start to unpack it all, so, but in case you're not clear about something. Okay. Yes, darling?
If I'm going, let's say I'm doing okay, and I'm going into a room, and in that room everybody is accepted. Automatically I will feel that.
I understand you. I understand you. I understand.
I'm the same thing, I'm going to a different room, everybody's smiling, happy. I'll start laughing automatically.
Exactly.
I can have no control over it.
Well, we can have control, but that's the right now we don't agree. So we're going to go into all that. That's when once I start to explain how the mind works, hopefully we'll get answers to that. Okay. Okay, let's look then at the contents of our mental consciousness, according to Buddhist psychology, coming from these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago. I mean, the Buddhist views, there are many variations of it that have developed over the centuries. Okay, so a simple way of dividing the contents, and this is coming, what's your name?
Neil.
Neil?
Yeah.
This is going to come slowly to your answer. So, as far as the Buddha is concerned, all these thousands of thoughts in our mental consciousness, in this workshop, we can divide them literally into three categories. This is sort of interesting. Initially it seems a bit simplistic, but it's really quite profound actually. And this is the basis of understanding Buddhist practice. And the basis, therefore, of the Buddha's conclusion that we can rid the mind of the rubbish and grow all the goodness. So in other words, the first two categories, he makes this distinction between the rubbish and the goodness. Speaking simply, okay. So really simply then you could say all these thoughts and feelings and emotions and unconscious and subconscious and all of this whole spectrum of our inner being, they all come down to being either so-called negative states of mind. These are the ones we can get rid of. So there's many synonyms here: negative, non-virtuous, disturbing emotions. You know, if you read Buddhist literature, afflictions, these, this sort of medieval phrase. Delusions is a really crucial term to understand. I like to call them all the voices of ego. This is the first category. And these, for the Buddha, as far as he's concerned, are distorted, not valid, neurotic, disturbing, misconceptions, liars, delusional. These are all synonyms for this stuff. So already it sounds kind of brutal. Oh, you mean I'm a bad person? Because that's how we think about it. Don't hear that way. It should, we're trying to work out what it is that's the source of our suffering. We're trying to work it out what it is in our mind that is the source of our pain. What it is, okay? So already Neil's point is indicating that all the unhappy people is the source, isn't it? As you just said, no control. And what you just said is so perfect, because that's how we are at the moment. Exactly right. So therefore we assume if you're among happy people, you'll be happy, and we assume you're around unhappy people, we'll be unhappy, isn't it? And as you said, I have no control. You're exactly right, Neil, at the moment. But the Buddha's saying we can be. That's all. And to do that job, we have to understand this one. So, okay, there are this set of states of mind that I like to call them the voices of ego. There's like a hierarchy of them. And we're going to only discuss one or two of them, and that's already profound, I tell you. But the root one, Buddha says the deepest misconception, the deepest negative state of mind, the deepest neurosis in us is so primordial that we don't even have a term for it in our culture. We don't really have a term. In fact, and this is known colloquially as ego grasping. It's a really subtle, deeply, instinctively ingrained misconception about our very sense of I. And this is why these Indians and then the Buddha use these techniques to go to the depths of their being to unpack and unravel this one. It's so subtle. It's extraordinary. So there's this Buddha saying there's this deep, instinctive, unhappy, separate, lonely, bereft, fear-based sense of I that underpins everything else. Then in this little hierarchy, if you like, the main voice of this unhappy I is not the word known as attachment. And this again, we could spend the rest of the 3 days not going past this word, just unpacking and unraveling this. And to really understand Buddhism and why we suffer, you've got to understand this. And again, this comes down to terminology. Because the way we use that word is virtually synonymous with goodness and close to people, and it's a good quality. So you can't, if you hear that when you hear the Buddha's use of it, you'll be very depressed. If we hear that attachment is a good thing, and we hear the Buddha says you've got to get rid of it, we go, oh, as Lama Zopa says, oh, you mean I've got to get rid of my happiness? I've got to get rid of my heart? We've got to use Buddha's definition. This is really important. It's not what we're thinking. He has a different definition of this word. Attachment is this, effectively, according to this packaging of Buddha's teachings known as the Four Noble Truths, this is the main source of our day-to-day suffering. These words are not how we talk, so they're going to sound puzzling, So if this is true, we better know what he means by attachment. Oh my goodness. So it's the main voice, I like to call it that, of this deepest one, the neurotic sense of I. And then what it is on the basis of this is that there's this frantic, we're born with this, the most fundamental energetic level of this attachment is a sense of dissatisfaction, a sense of never having enough, not being enough, always wanting more, no matter what I get, never enough, no matter what I achieve, never enough, no matter how thin I get, never enough, no matter how beautiful I get, never enough, no matter how I change my hair and my colour of my hair, never enough, no matter anything, never enough. It's this deep primordial sense of dissatisfaction. So then that next level of attachment that gives rise to, naturally, is this craving and hankering after something to fill up the gaping hole. And the first obvious gross level of this attachment is the objects of the senses. Then, let's just say I'm looking for a boy, So this little girl, you're wanting a boy. Boy seems to be the one, as well as the handbags, the dolls, of this and that, and people, blah, blah, blah. It's all there, the objects that we see out there through our senses. So naturally, we're walking around life, aren't we, determining if those particular objects will be the ones that my attachment wants. So then attachment is this dissatisfaction, neediness, craving. The next level of it is it gets the object, gets the panos, and suddenly, because you've been thinking about it and wanting this object, suddenly it lands on him. The I consciousness lands on that shape and colour, and then mad mental consciousness takes over, and attachment is so hungry and needy, it makes up this huge, fantastic story about how divine he is, and in a day you've got your whole life mapped out. Are we communicating? Yes. Okay. And just as one example, boy, it could be, some people, it could be handbags, it could be money, it could be anything. And don't hear this as punitive. Don't hear it as, oh, you're naughty. Don't hear it like that. We're trying to recognise what it is that causes pain. And this is working non-stop, this attachment. So the next level of attachment, what it's just done, this is the key thing that's done, on the basis of that dissatisfaction, the neediness, the looking, the manipulating, the finding, the expecting, and then the exaggerating takes over. That's its key job. It exaggerates his deliciousness, and then exaggerates his role in my happiness. And then the whole, and then we make it permanent. Like I always quote Nicole Kidman when she was with Tom Cruise. She said, "We will be together until we're 80. So much, I mean, you know, we'll go into all this. It's okay. So there's attachment, dissatisfaction, hunger, neediness, looking, manipulating, finding, exaggerating, then possessing. All of that is, all these words we've known, possessive, expectations, control freak, they're all just variations of how attachment works. Or another way to put it, it's like this junkie in us that only wants the nice things, meaning the objects that my mind calls nice. So the millisecond that attachment doesn't get what it wants, and that's 1,000 times a day, that's called aversion. Or a volatile level of aversion is anger. An internalized level of aversion is called depression. And we'll go into this. We'll discuss it. It's quite subtle. And this is not how we think, you know. So these are enough to even work out most of daily life. Attachment is the default mode, this assumption I must get what I want every second, which is only the nice things. The millisecond it doesn't get them, and it's 1,000 times a day, it will not get the nice things, then you have a panic attack. Aversion, how dare that be there? And if it's mild, it goes in, and one day you can't get out of bed because you're so depressed. Another person, you end up killing somebody. This sounds so simple, but this attachment and aversion are basically the running of most of the day. So because effectively, we are junkies. Attachment is a junkie that only wants the nice things. So even answering your question simply, Neil, and we have to go this more deeply, because attachment is constantly inside us needing things to be nice, frantic for things to be nice. It's hungry like a little kid for things to be nice. Can you hear that even? It's deep in our bones. We're not articulating it. You're not walking into that room hoping it'll be lovely so you'll feel happy. But as soon as you walk in that room and people are smiling, attachment just got what it wanted, so you're going to feel happy. The second you walk into the room where it's ugly, or the bad weather, or the lousy food, you understand, or the mean words from somebody, the assumption is that's not what the attachment wants, so you have a panic attack and freak out. That's what's happening. I mean, it's just, you know, but it takes a while to look at this. So the neediness in us for things to be nice is the basis of when you get an ugly thing, you know, you immediately feel bad, and when you get a nice thing, you immediately feel good. And this is what we have to start to unpack. And this is what makes us believe those mean, unhappy people are the source of my suffering, and the nice people are the source of my happiness. We all think this. It's reasonable. It's logical. The world is like this. And this doesn't mean there's not some learning from that. So yeah, stick around nice people, nothing wrong. But the Buddha's view is we've got to go deep into the mind to see the source of what it is in us that, and it's this massive expectation. Because the thing about attachment is it assumes that something out there has to fill me up. It assumes I'm nothing unless I get the nice thing. It's not that easy to see it, but this is a simple way of starting to explain it, Neil. So attachment then, the Buddha says is the key one in this daily life, and we can work with this one. But as Lama Yeshe says, I can tell you about attachment for one whole year. The word sounds so cute, you know. It goes to incredible subtlety. It'll take us a long time, he said, to really comprehend it and to build something up internally, you know. It's so instinctive, so primordial, so natural. So to begin to listen to it and unpack it is not that easy. It's massive. This is the essence of Buddhist practice, basically. So attachment and aversion or anger are the two key things in day-to-day life. We go between drunken sailors between these 1,000 times a day. But you can say the assumption of attachment is I've got to get the nice things. That's it. We can only cope. Attachment only wants the nice things, the good things, and that means the things that I want. I mean, Paros might really like chocolate cake. Maybe I love carrot cake. So it's, you know, we each determine which one it is that we want, and then we see it as that way, you know. So to get into this one is really quite intense. But to comprehend it first intellectually. Are we communicating even a little bit the meaning of these words, you know? Then in this hierarchy, if you like, jealousy and all the other dramas are all a result of all this. First there's ego grasping, then there's a constant craving to get what that fantasy I wants, then there's a panic attack and aversion and fear and drama and distress and annoyance and irritation and frustration, depression or anger. They're all variations of the same state of mind that come when attachment doesn't get what it wants. And we go between these 1,000 times a day. And this is primordially deep. It happens naturally. We take these things at the level of assumption. So we have to unpack. So what Buddha says is, Neil, when we learn to work with our mind, learn to get some clarity, learn to become familiar with the contents of our mind, we start to, let's say it simply, we start to realize that what's out there is not the main source of how we feel. We have to learn to do that we can learn to have control. It's sort of like saying, when you put your hands on the piano, you've got no control, you just have to play crummy notes. It's true if you don't know music, isn't it? You can't play beautiful Bach if you don't know theory, right? So we just assume, oh well, you just put your hands on the piano, bad notes are going to come out. Yeah, until you learn the theory. Do you understand? You're going to try and be a gardener but not know botany. You're going to make a mess out there. So Buddha's got some methods. It's called, it's called his view of the mind, that it doesn't have to be no control. We can learn by using his model to understand the workings of this underneath, and then learn to realize once you less, let's say, so okay, how would you be if you had less attachment and less aversion, these two simple states of mind? What you'd be is, you'd be much more content in yourself. You wouldn't be instinctively relying on the external world to be a certain way. So you walk into the bad weather or the horrible people, and you've got your own stability, your own clarity, and you'd even have compassion. And you wouldn't hang around because it's going to be a mess, but it wouldn't disturb you. Literally is what Buddha's saying. Literally we can learn to do that. And that's a puzzle to us, because we just assume it's natural that the external thing is the main cause of whether you're happy or suffering. This is why you said those words, isn't it? Do you understand?
Yeah.
Well, the Buddha says, no, you're wrong. He says he's got methods. We just don't learn these. I mean, we don't really have this level of clarity, I don't think, in our psychology about what to do, because we do assume, in all of our models of the mind, we do assume the external is the main cause of our suffering. So our main methods are try to avoid the suffering. But what do you do when you can't? What to do when you can't avoid the suffering? And that's the trouble. We go mad. We go crazy. I mean, many of my friends in prison are living in that environment, like you just said, all day. So they literally go mad because they don't have techniques for working on their minds. Do you understand my point? So the Buddha says, if you can change something, please change it. If you can get the hell out of that room of crazy people, then please do it. But what happens if you can't? Like if you're in prison, I tell you, some of these American prisons, madhouses, or everywhere prison, if you can't get past, I mean, there's this kind of prisons, well, it's everywhere, but certainly the ones I know, Americans, my Mexican gangster friends, in ex-gangsters in California. It's very funny, in the Californian prisons, they have all these gangs, right? It's like a special world, special gangs. Paros and I could be Neil and I could be in Los Angeles, and we could be, two gangs, one each of us, and we'd fight to the death, basically. That's our job. We would fight to the death. But if we both get arrested, overnight we will join the prison gang called the Southern Mexicans, the Soreños. And we would now give our life for each other. Overnight. Overnight we will change, we'll become a Soreños. And we will give our life, and our worst enemies are the Northern Mexicans. So the Southern Mexicans are all from Los Angeles and around there, and the Northern Mexicans from San Francisco. And all the Mexicans I know in prison are all from Los Angeles, so I kind of figure my gang is the Southerners, I joke about that. It's very funny. So, anyway, raving on here. So that proves it's made by the mind, doesn't it? If overnight Neil can look like my blood brother, but the day before I was going to kill him, I think that shows it's the mind, doesn't it? You've changed your interpretation. Overnight you've changed your interpretation. It proves the point. When you change your mind, you change everything. It's not kidding. Because overnight he's become my blood brother. We'll be put in the same cell. We'll give our lives for each other. But the day before we were trying to kill each other. That really should blow your mind, It proves it's the mind, isn't it? It proves. We call each other Soreños today and we're friends. Then we get out tomorrow, we'll kill each other again. I mean, it's like hilarious. So this is the thing that in Buddhism, there's this incredible clear distinction between what we call a virtuous quality and the neurotic ones. So when we hear this, we recognize attachment, we recognize anger, and we also recognize love. So if I say I love Neil, that means I have affection for him. I see what he needs. I have empathy. I have compassion when he gets a headache. I take care of him. I want him to be happy. That's called virtue. That's called love and compassion. We know those states of mind. But the trouble is we assume they're both equal in terms of being natural. But the Buddha goes way more deep. He says, don't be ridiculous. But it's obvious when I love Neil, meaning altruistically, and want him to be happy, it's obvious that I'm happy too. It's clear. But if I'm really attached and frantic and freaking out about losing him every minute, freaking out every time he looks at someone else, it's like you're in a nightmare. It's got some pleasant feelings in relation to it, but it's under threat the whole time. Because he mightn't look at me the right way, he might do the wrong thing, he might look at the girl the wrong way, and I'm in a constant panic. We all know it's unpleasant. But if we call it natural, we're never going to look at it, isn't it? It's just called natural, you won't look at it. Well, Buddha says that we can rid the mind of this one. This is the source of our suffering, it's intense. And it's a series of thoughts deep in our bones. We came programmed with it. Buddha says, so hard to recognize it. And on the